Shalom from Israel, I'm Ariel Ben Abram. This week we read Parshat Vayigash. It begins saying that then Judah approached him. That's what Vayigash means. Approached. And he approached. Him is Joseph, in this case, the viceroy of Egypt, and said, "Please, my lord, let now your servant speak something into my lord's ears, and let not your wrath be kindled against your servant, for you are like Pharaoh." Our sages say that this portion of the Torah, particularly the narration of Joseph's story, it's kind of crucial, fundamental, because for many reasons we're talking about two characters here, Judah and Joseph. Let's remember the story. Judah was the brother who came with the idea of selling Joseph to merchants. And then Judah is the one who is basically facing Joseph 22 years later. So it's like the member of the family who was responsible, so to speak, of whatever action was taken against Joseph was facing him. It's like, it's a very, very transcendental moment in the story. And our sages say that there was some kind of, the approach was a confrontational approach. It was not just as we read that, "Please, my lord." It's like, of course, there's some kind of reverence and respect, but they insist that, based on oral tradition, that Judah came to confront him. It's like, we have nothing to hide. We are honest people. We're not spies. We have told you the truth. We have nothing to fear. We don't fear you, basically. It's like, whatever you do, we have our consciousness clean. I mean, we are good people. Of course, in spite of the fact that they sold the brother to the merchant, to the slave traders. So this is very important to point out, because when we finally are get to a point in our consciousness in which we clear everything that is negative, like we are righteous people, we have nothing to fear. Now, that's one way to see it. Another way, which is very important, when Judah, at the end of this verse, the first verse of the portion, he said, "For you are like Pharaoh." This is a very, very important statement. So like, he was not the king, but he was like the king. So we have to define here once more, who is Pharaoh? What Pharaoh represents in our consciousness. So we have said that it represents the egocentric approach to life. It's an egotistic person. It's basically Pharaoh. So if we call someone Pharaoh, we tell him, "You are a selfish, egotistic person." Now, we have said also that Joseph represents love's ways and attributes. In other words, these good qualities, this kindness that Joseph represents, that actually were the qualities that gave him the reputation that he had in Egypt, because the Spirit of God, as we said before, was with him. So like there's some qualities that we have to cultivate in our consciousness, in our life. So we have God's spirits with us. So like God's spirit doesn't go with everyone, otherwise, as we said before last week, God's spirit would be with everyone. So and God's spirit is what with Judah and with Jacob or whatever. It wasn't. It was with Joseph. So then we have to analyze, we have to pay attention to what Joseph is and has done and is able to do. What are the traits, qualities of his consciousness that make him suitable to receive, to have God's Spirit with him? So it's like we want God to be with us. Of course, who doesn't? God is our creator. We want to know him. We want to know our creator. So then we read the Torah, and the Torah tells us about God's ways and attributes. The Torah doesn't give, it's very important, doesn't give us a definition of someone who has no definition. So God himself tells us his ways and attributes, so we can relate to him. And by relate, I'm talking about to conceive him in some way. It's inconceivable, but in our human minds we need to have references. We need to know something about him. So Moses, our teacher, asked God, said, we want to know you. We want to know more about you. Tell us. God says, sure. Then he told Moses the 13 attributes of compassion, commonly known as the 13 attributes of mercy. It's like this is how God relates with us. So it's like if that's our link with him, our common bond with him, that's how he relates to us, then we have to be like him, like the way he relates to his creation. So that's the way. So that's basically what Joseph was doing. Just following God's will. So God's Spirit was with him. Now, let's go back to this verse. It's very, very, very fundamental to analyze thoroughly. Because you are like Pharaoh. So it's like we have said that Pharaoh represents the egotistic approach to life. And Joseph loves ways and attributes, who is guiding Pharaoh's domains. Pharaoh is delegating on Joseph the rulership of Egypt. He's the ruler. We read in the previous portion that Pharaoh gave Joseph his signet, ring. It's like you will rule here. It's going to be your way. So it's interesting when everything is delegated, like assigned to love's ways and attributes, everything goes right. It's like love's ways and attributes is good management, basically. Good rulership, good regency. So in this sense, Judah recognizes in Joseph someone like Pharaoh. So the lesson here is that ego as the driving vital force in our lives needs a sense of direction. So it's like love as well as ego, both love and ego are powerful rulers. The idea is that they have to work together. Ego has to delegate direction to love's ways and attributes. This is guide me, rule my domains, rule in my domains. When Joseph finds and sees, it's like this character is like Pharaoh. So it's like Judah is knowing, is learning from all this situation. It's like, you are a fair king. So I don't want your wrath be kindled against your servant. It's like, I don't want your separation. In this case, wrath is to separate. When we are wrathful and pride, we separate from the oneness that is the rest of our surroundings. So it's like we ask love not to separate from us. Because we are destroyed in that separation, in that wrath. So, this encounter between Joseph and Judah will have consequences later. We will see that the descendants of Joseph will separate from the descendants of Judah. Many centuries, some centuries later. And the kingdom of Israel will be divided in the kingdom of Judah in the south and the kingdom of Israel in the north. And then Ephraim, which is Joseph's firstborn, will take away 9 of the tribes, which ended up assimilated in other nations, within other nations. And then Judah will be left alone. So we Jews are descendants of Judah. That's what we call Jews. So, our prophets say that in the future, these two characters, Ephraim and Judah, will go back together. Now, the issue here is what, again we repeat, what Joseph and Judah represent. Joseph represents love's ways and attributes, we have said that. And Judah represents regency, the kind of direction or determination, it's better to call it determination, to live, to rule, to encompass and integrate all aspects of life. That's the kingdom, that's Judah. But again, Joseph, we say, is the complement. It's not the opposite. It's the complement of that determination, which is love, love's ways and attributes. So in the end of time, the two tribes are going to unite for the purpose of the Messianic era. So everything would be integrated. So let's be aware that in this case, Ephraim represents the encompassing consciousness of all creative, positive potentials represented by the rest of the tribes. So if Ephraim had the power to assimilate, to absorb, to control, to separate 9 tribes out of the kingdom of Judah. Ephraim represents the integration, the encompassing of all of the remaining tribes. So when we read in Jewish prophecy that when they refer to as Ephraim or Joseph, we're talking about the rest of the tribes integrated in one purpose, one common purpose, which is love's ways and attributes. The so-called quality that we have to cultivate, that we have to integrate in all levels of consciousness in order to fulfill God's plan for the end of times, what is called the Messianic era, the final redemption in Judaism. So we're talking about here about something that separated abruptly in the beginning, selling Joseph, and then later coming back as a conflictual relationship between the 2 brothers and the descendants. But again, this conflicted, separating conflict would be reconciled and reunited again, as it happened here. It happened here. See, like Judah returns saying, "Here we are." And then at some point in the story, as we will see, Joseph say, "Okay, I am who I am. I am your brother." So it's like, don't be afraid. So we must read that part. He said, "But do not be sad. But now do not be sad, and let it not trouble you." They were afraid that Joseph was going to take revenge, retaliation against them. So he basically appeased them, saying, "And let it not trouble you that you sold me here. For it was to preserve life that God sent me before you." To preserve life. So it's like, in other words, God has a greater purpose. Now, what is the lesson here? Well, yes, the lesson is to appease the fear of the brothers. It's like, brother, this guy's gonna kill us now. No. That's one. So it's like, we have to clear our fears, apprehensions against the negative things that we do. It's like they will come back to us eventually when we make negative choices and negative decisions. But in this case, everything is forgiven and forgotten. It's like, don't be afraid. Don't be sad. So, it was to preserve life that God sent me before you. Let's talk about this, because this is chapter 25 of Genesis, the book of Genesis, verse 5. For it was to preserve life. In this case, life represents the idea of going down to Egypt was to survive the famine. So in this case, we understand to preserve life. But on the other hand, we're talking about God's plan. It's like that God sent me before you. There is a plan that is God's plan. And we're going to concentrate the rest of this commentary on this. We have this false notion that because we have free will, we can do whatever we want at the expense of our own life and at the expense of the lives of others. That ultimately we do what we want. It's like it's the ego ruling, So it's like we believe that we are not part of a major plan. We separate from God's ways and attributes. We don't want to know about that. We don't want to be connected to that. We want to be connected to our own inventions, our own egos, fantasies and illusions. Then we follow them. We don't believe that there's a plan. So we disregard in a very, how can we say? Anyway, there are many words that we can apply here, but the whole idea is to say that we have the nerve to say to our Creator, you know what? I don't care if you created me or not. I do whatever I want. That's it, as simple as that. It's like there is no other way but my way. So it's like, let's imagine for a moment this inventor, a guy who has a lot of knowledge in terms of high tech, high technology kind of thing. And he created a robot. He programmed it in a very, very peculiar details, about everything, the way it behaves, how it responds, and everything. And then we are that inventor, we created it. It's like, okay, then it's gonna do exactly what we want. That's exactly what's gonna happen. And suddenly this android at one point says, you know what, I'm gonna do whatever I want. I don't wanna do your will. How would we feel about that? It's like something went wrong. Well, it's not quite the same example. What we're trying to say is that we created, let's say that we are the inventor. We created an android with free will. Just like, in other words, whatever you do is your own business. I created you, you're free to do whatever you want. I don't expect anything from my creation. However, I told my creation, my creature, my android, you have free will. However, whatever consequences, whatever decisions you make, they will have consequences. Okay, so if you make the right choices, you will have right outcomes. And if you make negative decisions, beware, you can be destroyed. You can be, you can end your life based on the negative choices you make. Okay, so under that premise, our android goes out. So we start observing, we have some kind of a computer, like transmitter, like knowing everything that this android does. Everything. So we see, what he says, what he does, whatever, everything. Okay, so then the android at some point says, you know what? I'm gonna take negative decisions from now on. And what I think it is right, not what my creator told me, I'm gonna do. That's basically. Then at some point, this android realizes that the negative choices that he or she is making, in case that they have genders, are basically destroying him. Then he decided to go back and said, inventor, you were right, I made these mistakes. I'm gonna go back to the way you told me to. So it's interesting to see it sometimes in these ways, because we're so egocentric, so self-centered, that we never think about God. How would he feel or think about us? Of course, we know the Torah tells us that he loves us unconditionally, etc. But the Torah also says that he has ways and attributes that we have to emulate. The choices that he is asking us to make. Because he has a plan. It's not just to do right choices just for the sake of good choices. There is a plan after that. In other words, when everything is fine and we do everything positive, there is a plan coming after that, which we don't know. So probably some people believe that it's going to be boring doing goodness all the time. It's like, let's do evil every once in a while just for a change. Then we basically foil, we spoil the purpose. Then we go back doing the same, falling in the same vicious circle of evil, wickedness, negative, getting negative, etc., etc., etc. The never-ending cycle. So the idea is to preserve life that God sent me before you. It's like, there's a plan. God has a plan. He sent me here. You didn't send me here. Now, this is some kind of a paradox, some kind of ambiguity. It's like I'm selling someone as a slave, a brother of mine. I did it. I mean, it's like, it's a fact. It's a choice that I made. And suddenly, later, 22 years later, the person whom I sold tells me, says, you didn't sell me here. God sent me here. So it's like, hey, even the wicked things that I do have a good purpose. No, you have to be careful with this. You have to be careful with this. It's like, it seems like a green light to do negative things, because ultimately everything is going to be fine. Yes, there's some beliefs in Judaism that proclaim this. It's like, oh, ultimately everything is going to be fine, so be careful, beware, be aware. Doesn't work this way. If it would have been that easy, the process of rectifying a negative action wouldn't have taken place in this story. There was a necessary process here. It's like, you guys made a mistake. You shouldn't have done what you did. You have to rectify what you do. In order to do that, Joseph tested them many times to make sure that he was not dealing with wicked people as they were before, 22 years earlier. So there's a lesson here that we have to learn. We must not be evil, negative. That's a lesson that we have to learn. Now, there is a major purpose. We preserve life. Now, it's interesting, life, that the lives of the Egyptians as the lives of the Jews or the Hebrews as the lives of the rest of the world. So we're talking about a general life to be preserved. But also there's a particular life to be preserved, which is the lives of the children of Israel in this particular case. So we're going to survive in Egypt, but we're going to be enslaved. So Joseph is telling his brothers what's going to happen in the future, later in this portion. There's going to be a great deliverance later. We are here because we're going to be delivered in a big way later. So like Joseph is aware of what is this plan that God has. We're talking about in our current times, how can we translate this experience from Egypt to our current times? That's the whole idea of learning this Torah. It's like how this resonates in our consciousness. See, who's Judah, who are the brothers, who's Joseph? What God is doing in this connection. What is the purpose? Deliverance. But it's interesting because the deliverance will come after a period of time of suffering under slavery. A very, very painful process. So what is the process? Part of a plan. So we have to understand sometimes, no, not sometimes, we have to understand all the time that all the choices we make have consequences, but besides that, there's a plan, there's a major plan beyond egos, fantasies, and illusions. So beyond our immediate wanting, needing, and desiring, there's a greater purpose. So the invitation is to be aware enough, wise enough, to start looking, what is that plan? So we study Torah, we learn. And we see that there's a purpose. What is the purpose of life? Goodness. That's the life that we preserve. We need to preserve for a greater purpose. Greater than slavery, greater than egotism, greater than egos, fantasies, and illusions. We have to go beyond that. Now, in the portion also says, there's a passage in which Pharaoh met Yaakov. And he asked him, he's like, tell me about the days of your life. And Yaakov answered, they have been few and evil. Few and evil. So Segi said, what does that mean? What's the meaning of that? We have to understand that in this case Jacob is Israel. It's like some kind of the negative predicament. I mean, like the life of Israel, the life of Jacob, Israel, was a difficult life from beginning to end. And his life represents Israel's as the nation life. So it's like our days have been few and evil. They have. It's not a pessimistic approach to life. It's not being pessimistic. It's being realistic. They have been persecuted, massacred, assimilated, destroyed, exploited, abused, humiliated. It's like, so when have we had a really good times? You know, like throughout Jewish history, it's like few periods. Same thing with the exile, the slavery in Egypt. It's like probably was worse, obviously. Working as a slave, 14 hours a day, more probably, every day, for many years. That seems to be worse. But it's like between two evils. Actually, both are evils. So it's like, what is like, one is better than the other. So in this case, everything, every negative approach to life is negative regardless of how intense this evil or negativity are. It's evil. We don't want that. We want to live in peace, in harmony. We want to contribute to the betterment of humankind. So everybody would be happy. That's the whole idea of Judaism. That's our commandment, to be light unto the nations. Is to bring goodness, the goodness of life, and preserve life. Not to destroy it, exploit it, or humiliate it, or abuse it, or anything like that. Harm, damage life. No. So we have to understand then that when we assume, I mean, we integrate, implement, exercise our Jewish identity, we apply what the Torah is telling us to be and to do. So there's a greater purpose. The purpose is goodness. The purpose is to preserve life. Exactly what Joseph is telling his brother. His brothers. But the idea is to do this harmonically, preserve life for the sake of life, for the sake of the goodness of life. That's the great lesson about Judaism for us Jews and for humankind. It's goodness as a purpose beyond our own perception. It's like sometimes we don't know the implications or the results, the outcome of a good action. We really don't know. It seems simple sometimes, helping cross the street someone, or helping with money someone who needs to pay something. We have no idea how good that could be. We don't. So in the same way that we can save lives by doing a good action, imagine what goodness can do out of our scope, our perception. We really don't know that. We don't conceive that. So it's like, well, in the Messianic era, we're talking about the future, the redemption, the final redemption that we want. Getting out of this slavery under ego's fantasies and illusions, addictions, obsessions, habits, ideologies, beliefs, that to which we are attached, that doesn't give us the freedom that we yearn for every moment for so many centuries. When we get to that moment in which everything is good, we have no idea how good it's gonna be. So it's like, don't start thinking about the Messianic era and our final redemption as somebody like walking in the street and kissing each other and embracing each other and smiling at each other. It's a greater, bigger projection to that. We have no idea what that is until we get there. That is what we will live if we preserve life, the goodness of life, for a greater purpose called God's will. So we have to start tuning into our Creator. We are creatures made by God. We didn't make ourselves, as some of us believe. It's like, okay, when I meet a female partner, we're gonna have babies, and we are creating babies. Yeah, that's the general agnostic conception about life. And we own our lives. But until we start thinking, assimilating, not thinking, grasping, assimilating, that we belong to a Creator who has a purpose for us. Yes, He gave us free will, yes, but for to make the right choices, the choices for life, to preserve life. The blessings, not the curses. Then we will see that there's a greater purpose in that. So the whole point is in this parasha is to understand the story of Joseph as something, yes, designated, assigned, prepared, orchestrated, so to speak, by God for a greater purpose, which is to preserve life. So it's like sometimes, yes, we can do things that are negative, but ultimately they serve a purpose to learn something from it. It's like, yes, we made mistakes, we shouldn't have sold a brother. Yes, that's a lesson to be learned. But at the same time, hey, something good happened. God turned our negative actions into something positive. That's also part of the Messianic consciousness. All the negative trends in consciousness are going to be shifted, turned into something positive. So they will cease to be negative. That's the meaning of it. It's like we're not going to get evil, we're going to get good, out of the bad, evil things that we do. No, not that way. It's like the intention, the trend, the inclination to do something negative, it will be directed to do something positive, something good. That's the thing. So that vital force called ego, that fire that we have, each one of us in our consciousness, will be redirected towards the ruling, the regency of God, love's ways and attributes. So in that way, every twisted, every negative decision that we make will have a good end. But we have to understand it again, not as doing evil, but as taking this inclination to do something positive. That's the idea, to preserve life. Life as the extension of God's love in the material world. Life is the material manifestation of God's love. It's tangible to us. That's what He wants us to live, to see and to experience as something good. So we have to preserve the goodness for the sake of goodness, and for the sake of a greater purpose of goodness that we have no idea what that is until we get there. So, I hope that these reflections can resound in a positive way in our consciousness, to be closer to God, to understand God's plan, to understand our connection with Him, our bond with Him. Our common bond with Him is love. So we can learn God's ways, also love's ways, positive things, positive qualities, positive traits for positive ends. That's the whole purpose of creation. If we don't do it now, it will happen sooner or later. It's a matter of time. At what point we're going to learn that we cannot dwell with anything different than love's ways and attributes. That love's ways and attributes do not cohabit with something negative, different than that, than those. And then we will live in peace, we will live harmonically, we will be together and united for the greater purpose, the ultimate greater purpose of love that we don't know. Besides the immediacy of the goodness of it that we will enjoy, and that we start enjoying when we decide to make positive choices. The goodness in what we think, what we are, what we do, what we feel, what we say, and what we are. That's our essence and identity, who we are. We're made of goodness, to be goodness. That's the purpose of the Torah is telling us that that's the purpose. So let's be aware of it. Let's be it. Okay, have a blessed remaining days of Hanukkah and a very blessed week, rest of the week. Have an inspired, restful, and insightful Shabbos, Shabbat Shalom, and until next week.